Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. Over the course of our recent episodes on this channel, we've been reviewing our list of 25 proto-prog albums. These are albums released in the late 1960s that influenced and provided the foundation for the genre of music that has come to be known as progressive rock. In our first installment in this series, we listed the 25 albums and provided our criteria for selecting them. If you haven't yet seen that episode or would like to review that again, you can do so on this YouTube channel at this link. We have also, since that initial episode, done deep dives on some 20 or so of the albums on the list, reviewing them from a content and cultural perspective. Those episodes are available on this channel too. Please feel free to go and check those out as well. We think you'll enjoy them. Our episode for today covers an album released in mid-1969 by Julie Driscoll, Brian Auger, and the Trinity, their double album, Streetnoise. This band is one that is probably better known to audiences in Europe and in the UK than in North America. Brian Auger particularly would ultimately achieve fame in the 1970s with his subsequent band, the Oblivion Express. But the Trinity did not take off quite the way that Auger had anticipated, despite the fact that the band put together 4 very strong albums. By the time Streetnoise, their third album, was made in 1969, Brian Auger had already become a veteran of the London music scene. He had been working in bands going back to the late 1950s, and by early 1965 was fairly well established. He had started his first version of his band, the Trinity, with bass player Rick Fenson and drummer Mickey Waller, and was managed by Giorgio Gomelsky, who at the time was also managing the Yardbirds and previously had assisted the Rolling Stones with jump-starting their career at his club, the Crawdaddy. Auger's big break came in 1965 when the band leader from a rival band, Long John Baldry, approached him about the possibility of joining forces in a larger and more full-scale review. Long John Baldry was also a veteran of the London music circuit. He had worked in the early 60s with Cyril Davies and Alexis Korner in Blues Incorporated, one of the foundational bands that ultimately the Rolling Stones grew out of as well. In the early 1960s, Baldry was running his blues review, the Hoochie Coochie Men, which at the time featured a young but very potent singer by the name of Rod Stewart. Baldry proposed to Auger that the two bands should combine, and after some discussion, it was agreed that the Trinity would provide the foundation for the band, which Auger effectively would become the manager of, with Baldry and Stewart also joining as vocalists. In addition, Brian Auger suggested that another vocalist be added, Julie Driscoll. Julie Driscoll was a newcomer to the scene in 1965. She at the time was just 18 years old and was working for Giorgio Gomelsky in his office, primarily answering the Yardbirds fan mail. But Auger and Gomelsky recognized that Julie Driscoll had a few attributes to bring to the table that were important. First off, she was an exceptionally attractive young woman with features not unlike those of an English cover girl at the time. She also had a very potent, very sultry voice that spanned several octaves. She was quite talented and was a very good fit for the project that Auger and Baldry were looking to launch. The new band became known as the Steam Packet and was effectively a blues revue that would open shows with Auger and the Trinity playing and Brian Auger occasionally taking on lead vocals. In turn, Auger would bring Julie Driscoll on stage to sing. She, in turn, after a few numbers, would bring out Rod Stewart, and eventually John Baldry would join them. So this band had 3 lead vocalists and occasionally a 4th. The Steam Packet would work together for about a year and a half, from early 1965 through the summer of 1966, and were quite popular on the UK and European touring circuit, doing many gigs at clubs and theaters, and at one point opening shows for the Rolling Stones. They were not able to record together due to contractual differences between the various members' managers. Auger and Driscoll were contracted to Giorgio Gomelsky, while John Baldry and Rod Stewart worked with another manager. So getting into the recording studio was unfortunately not possible, although some tape recordings of the band have survived. But the band were very, very well regarded. Over the course of their tenure, Giorgio Gomelsky also made sure that Brian Auger stayed active as a session musician. Most notably during this time, Auger was used to play harpsichord on what would become the Yardbirds' breakthrough single, For Your Love, in 1965. The Steam Packet would ultimately break up in the summer of 1966. By this time, relationships within the band were becoming a bit strained. Rod Stewart and Julie Driscoll were both craving the spotlight, and from some accounts were not particularly friendly towards one another. Ultimately, Stewart was fired from the band prior to a tour of France, and following that tour, the band made the decision to call it a day. Brian Auger, at that time, decided to regroup and start a new version of the Trinity, which he did with bassist Dave Ambrose and drummer Clive Thacker. Giorgio Gomelsky, recognizing that the Trinity were a commodity that could be successful, signed them to a recording contract. He started his own record label, Marmalade Records, which released recordings through Polydor in the UK. This was significant because Polydor, in addition to being one of the larger record companies in the European sector, also had a distribution agreement in the United States with Atlantic Records. Gomelsky also signed Julie Driscoll, and the agreement was made that Driscoll and Auger would continue to work together in this new version of the band. The band began work on their first album, Open, in late 1967, with recording continuing into early 1968, with Giorgio Gomelsky producing. Gomelsky made the decision to sequence the album in 2 halves, with the first half of the album featuring Brian Auger and the Trinity performing without Julie Driscoll, and the second half, side 2 of the album, with Driscoll on vocals on all selections. It's not entirely certain, but I tend to think that this might have been a marketing strategy on Gomelsky's part to see which version of the band worked best with listening audiences. The public made that decision quite clear, not through the album itself, but through a non-album single recorded during the Open sessions. That single was This Wheel's on Fire. This Wheel's on Fire was, of course, one of the songs from Bob Dylan and the band's Basement Tapes sessions recorded in 1967, which had not, in late 67, early 68, been officially released, but were circulating in the UK as bootlegs, with Manfred Mann in particular taking one song from the Basement Tapes, The Mighty Quinn, into the top 10 in that time period. This Wheels on Fire was written by Bob Dylan providing the lyrics and Rick Danko of the band providing most of the music, and was a solid vehicle both for Driscoll's voice and for Brian Auger's Hammond organ and mellotron work. The song was a very, very big hit in the UK, reaching the top 10. It was also released in North America by Atlantic Records' Atco subsidiary. In Canada, the single reached the top 20. The single was not successful, however, in the United States. It only reached number 106 on the Billboard charts, the so-called bubbling under the top 100. The song, however, did get the band on Atlantic Records' radar. As I mentioned, when Open was made, it wasn't necessarily clear that this version of the band was going to continue together as constructed with Julie Driscoll as part of the band. And so, given that, Auger with Ambrose and Thacker made an album without Julie Driscoll very quickly on the heels of Open. That album, Definitely What, came out in early 1969. It features Brian Auger on vocals on several selections, but most notably features the band at its best as an instrumental unit. It's also particularly notable in that it was recorded at Advision Studios by, at the time, a very young engineer by the name of Eddy Offord, who would have a very large role to play in the fortunes of several progressive rock bands in the years to come. Following the success of This Wheels on Fire, Polydor in the UK wanted to see a follow-up album from the Trinity with Julie Driscoll present. That album would become Streetnoise. Streetnoise was made at Advision Studios during late 1968 and early 1969. Giorgio Gomelsky is credited as the album's producer. In reality, much of the musical direction of the album was taken on by Brian Auger, with some assistance from Eddy Offord. Giorgio Gomelsky, however, structured the album, and its presentation is very much the same as that was used on Open, with the exception that his technique of bracketing Auger's and Driscoll's contributions are spread across 4 sides of the album, with it being a double album instead of a single. Specifically, sides 1 and 4 of the album feature Driscoll fronting the group. Side 2 of the album focuses squarely on Driscoll. Side 3 of the album focuses largely on Brian Auger and the Trinity as instrumentalists. The album is exceptional as far as its musical content is concerned. It opens with a great instrumental piece from Auger and the Trinity, Tropic of Capricorn. That moves on to a terrific composition by Julie Driscoll, Czechoslovakia, which opens as a group composition and transitions into a very stark piece with Driscoll's vocals backed by just an acoustic guitar. And it's very, very striking. Side 2, the Julie Driscoll side, features an interesting reading of Light My Fire by Driscoll and the band. Remember, the Doors' version of Light My Fire at this point wasn't even known to the public for a full 2 years, and it had already been covered very successfully in the United States by Jose Feliciano. Given those circumstances, you wouldn't think that another artist could so quickly, on the heels of those efforts, make the song their own. But Driscoll does. She does a wonderful job with it. She follows that up with a cover of Richie Havens' Indian Rope Man, which is also expertly done. And then the album's tour de force, Driscoll's reading of the traditional piece When I Was a Young Girl. absolutely brilliant. Her voice is wonderful, sultry, evocative on this one. Driscoll's side of the album closes with her reading of Let the Sunshine In, The Flesh Failures, from the musical Hair, which of course was very popular in late 1968 when the album was being made. Auger's side of the album is exceptional from a musical perspective. The lead-off track on side 3, Ellis Island, is a killer, beautiful track. Side 4 of the album goes back to various cover versions with Driscoll fronting the band. If this band was guilty of any problems with its repertoire, is that it probably relied a little bit too much on covers. There are covers of Save the Country and of All Blues, respectively Laura Nero's piece, later covered by the Fifth Dimension, and the Miles Davis piece, presented here with the lyrics by Oscar Brown Jr., are very well done, but they are cover versions, and they're, at this point in time, very familiar as being the work of other artists. Streetnoise, however, despite those potential faults, is nonetheless a great record, and it was particularly helped in an unexpected way. Because of the success of This Wheel's on Fire, even though the song hadn't done all that well in the United States, the band was approached to participate in an American television special called 33 1/3 Revolutions per Monkey. Yes, those monkeys. The Monkees TV series, by the time of these negotiations, had been canceled by NBC Television after 2 years. But NBC had contractual rights to do up to 3 one-hour specials with the band. 33 1/3 would be the first of the 3. As it turned out, it would be the only special made because shortly after 33 1/3 was complete, Peter Tork left the group. 33 1/3 Revolutions per Monkey is not what you'd expect from the Monkees, at least not in the context of a television show. This was psychedelia to a national television audience in an hour-long television show. What made it particularly interesting was that although the special was ostensibly the Monkees' show, a significant amount of dialogue, probably more in fact than the Monkees got themselves, went to Brian Auger and Julie Driscoll, with them getting several spots to perform their music, none of which was featured on Streetnoise, by the way. In part because of the band's being featured on 33 1/3 Revolutions per Monkey, they were top of mind to American audiences despite not having had an American hit. And so when Streetnoise came out, it was awaited by radio DJs and accepted by American audiences. The album, despite its not having a hit single attached to it, and despite the double album length and price that went with it, reached number 41 on the American Billboard charts. Quite an achievement, considering that this band, from the standpoint of American audiences, really was almost coming out of nowhere. They didn't last much longer in this form. Julie Driscoll would leave the Trinity not long after Streetnoise was made. Brian Auger would change his management and move to another record label for the Trinity's 4th album in 1970, B4, until putting the band to rest and launching the Oblivion Express in 1971, which was quite successful, making multiple albums over the course of about 7 years' worth of existence. Julie Driscoll would pursue a solo career, but it was an avant-garde career, to be sure. Working with her husband, Keith Tippett, she would be very well remembered for an album called Septober Energy, made under the auspices of Tippett's band Centipede, so called because it involved no less than 50 different musicians at various turns on different instruments. Septober Energy, which was produced by King Crimson's band leader Robert Fripp, a good friend of both Tippett and Driscoll, was a demanding listen. It was a double album which consisted of 4 long continuous tracks, some of which were very experimental in their content. The album did not sell terribly well in the UK. It was not even issued in the United States until 1974, 3 years after its initial release. But it is heralded as being an interesting and very innovative work. Driscoll would continue to do various projects on and off with Tippett throughout Tippett's life. Tippett unfortunately died in 2020. Driscoll became known to a new generation of fans in the early 1990s through yet another television show, Absolutely Fabulous. When Ab Fab, as it was known, began production in 1992, its creator, Jennifer Saunders, wanted to use as theme music a song that was evocative of the late 1960s. Towards that end, she commissioned Julie Driscoll to record a new version of This Wheel's on Fire in partnership with Saunders' husband and musician, Adrian Edmondson. This recording was used for the first several years of the series as its theme. From a prog rock perspective, Julie Driscoll, Brian Auger, and the Trinity influenced the genre in many ways, both with their music as a band and with their individual contributions. Brian Auger was a master of the Hammond organ, and while his musical leanings were probably more jazz-inflected than classical, he made a tremendous impact on the Hammond players of the day. Keith Emerson, in particular, was a fan and maintained a personal friendship for many years with Auger. As for Julie Driscoll, her voice was a wonderful instrument. In her day, it was often compared to that of the American singer Grace Slick of the Jefferson Airplane. I personally, as a musician, tend to dismiss that particular comparison. Driscoll's voice is a superior instrument in terms of its range and in terms of the subtlety that Julie Driscoll would use in approaching a song. If anything, I tend to think of Driscoll more as a forerunner to the work that Annie Haslam would later do with Renaissance. Just an absolutely beautiful voice. If you haven't heard the music of this band, and I would dare say that most American listeners aren't really very familiar with this band, definitely give a listen. This is a great time to do so. In early 2024, work was done to remaster and redistribute much of the work of both Brian Auger and the Trinity and of Brian Auger's Oblivion Express. So those records are available now in high quality format for the first time in many, many years. And that's something that I would personally take advantage of. Also in early 2024, in part to support those re-releases, Brian Auger did an extensive interview with Prog magazine in their issue number 147. That is worth looking up as well to find out more about this band and about Auger's career in general. That's all for this episode. We hope, as always, that you enjoyed it. If you did, please click on like, and of course, please subscribe to the channel so that you can keep up with more episodes in this series and other topics in the world of prog rock. Our next episode will be on an album that was released at about the same time as Streetnoise was, but which is, I think, significantly better known. Jethro Tull's album, Stand Up, is the next album on our list. Thanks again for listening. You take good care. Bye-bye.